Okay, everyone, without further ado, let's kick off the next session, British Education Going Global, the International Opportunity. Now, as a direct result of the Brexit vote, our research suggests that 73% of our members say that they plan to export more as a result of the vote. That's going up, moving from about 28% of revenues on average to about 41% within the next 4 years alone. So people have big export ambitions within BESA membership. And not just the EU, but also, of course, exporting to the US, China, the UAE, India and Australia, which are the kind of top 5 at the moment. When I met with Dr. Liam Fox alongside Caroline earlier in the month, he emphasised that he believed UK education alongside law had the potential to be a tremendous export success story over the coming periods. And actually, I'm delighted to have a panel here today that are already playing a very instrumental role in making education that export success story. So without further ado from me, I'm very keen to move over to the panel. We have Vipul Bhargava, who's the Global Lead for Education Technology at the Department for International Trade. We have Alan Hudson, who's the Director of Programmes in Leadership and Policy at the University of Oxford, to my immediate left. And Alan particularly has been heading up a lot of Oxford University's engagement in China. And actually in the autumn of 2013, as a result of this, he was presented with the Golden Magnolia Awards for outstanding service to the city of Shanghai. Shanghai. So there we are.
Yeah, you can't eat it.
And then last but very much not least, on my far left, we have Kirk, who's an education consultant at the moment, but you may also know him as holding a very senior leadership role within GEMS, the world's largest private school group. He also has recently been nominated to be the next General Secretary of ASCL, the Association of School and College Leaders. So we have a great panel that's really already playing a major role in raising the profile of UK education exports. Very keen to hear from them. So 3 to 5 minutes. First over to you, Vipul, to tell your story. How long have you been in post now? I should check.
10 months now.
10 months.
Yes, 10 months. So, as Patrick said, I'm responsible for helping British education companies, but in particular EdTech and independent schools, export outside the UK. And to be honest, I've been in this role for 10 months, prior to which I was in the private sector, largely doing business in Latin America, Europe, Asia, so pretty much all over the world. So feel quite ready for the job. And to be honest, it's been an honor so far. Over the last 10 months, I think the cash cow, so to speak, of the business of the government has been to set up independent schools across the world, because those are the big 40, 50 million pound deals. And so the focus on EdTech hasn't been that great historically, because we haven't really understood it. But over the last 10 months, I've tried to bring that in a little bit. And really, I'm quite amazed at the appetite that there is globally for it. We've had opportunities from China. Of course, you'll hear us talk about China a lot. But China, UAE a little bit, increasingly Latin America. But the demand for British EdTech is really quite staggering, and it's been a bit of an eye-opener for me as well. So I'm very excited to be in this role. The challenge that I have is, with all other forms of what the department does in education, we have a limited number of suppliers. There are about 100 schools who are looking to export. There are a few oil and gas training companies. There are probably more vocational training institutes, but there are 1,000 EdTech companies, and almost all of them look to export pretty quickly. So how do you support 1,000 companies that are looking to go outside of UK when there's really one person over here? So I think the challenge right now we have is, how do we make this more scientific rather than this matchmaking where there's one opportunity coming up in Burma, who can do this, try and make that happen. How do we do that more efficiently? And I think that's the real challenge that I have.
Thank you, Vipul. Alan, if I could turn to you next.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with a couple of statistics. 63.5% of all Chinese students who go abroad never go back, or haven't gone back yet, which is very striking, both in terms of the quality of the education they're getting, not only in Britain, but also is one of the problems, because there aren't many opportunities, and certainly for what you might call creative free thinking when they go back to China, which is one of the things I want to end on, is the question of maximising UK possibilities without losing the best of what there is in the UK education system by adapting to other standards. The second statistic, or series of statistics, is the number of international students at Oxford. The highest number is American, 1441, as of the beginning of the last academic year. China is second at 1,047, Germany third at 837, and India fourth at 408. I just throw that in terms of the fact that it's a global university, not a European university. And my last statistic, and because it's largely going to be around China that I have to speak, although I personally dealt with, in terms of my job, with many other countries from the United States to the autonomous Iraqi part of Kurdistan, is that we've dealt with over 5,000 senior Chinese public officials, academics, administrators and entrepreneurs in the last decade. There's been a couple of shifts which I think are also worth bearing in mind in terms of the development of the environment. One is the changing composition. It began with basically the party, and now is increasingly getting people from the private sector. The private sector is much, much bigger in China than most people recognise. It's by far the most responsible for 50, 60, even more percent of GDP, and all the significant innovation is happening in the private sector. Most of the money going to state enterprises is like shoveling it down a well of corruption, despite the recent campaign. And the second is the changing priorities. We started off by doing rather boring stuff on appraisal with speakers from the then National School of Government. We moved through social management, which in China means everything from welfare reform to coercion. And most recently, the flavours of the month, according to the recent 5-year plan, are innovation and creative cities. So in a 3 weeks' time, I've got a delegation coming from Yangpu, which is the sort of East London equivalent of Shanghai, the old industrial area. But it's also the location of two of the major universities, Tongji and Fudan, and they're coming to speak to us about how we can help in the development of their so-called knowledge hubs. I'm sorry to have to use those rather meaningless phrases, but it's to get it across. So creativity and innovation are the buzzwords of the recent the 5-year plan, and they're vastly overused. I prefer the word thinking myself. And that's the merit, I think, of what we've got to offer as a university and as an educational environment. So that's my word of warning. I think it is an open door, not just in China and many other places, not least, of course, because of the accident of being Anglophone. And the fact that it's an international language is something that we have got and we can't really throw away. And if you look at the structure of the world's universities in terms of the Times Higher, you'll see an increasing predominance of Anglophone universities. And the European universities who make it in the top are also teaching in English. Most of them are in Holland or Germany or Scandinavia, alongside the growth of Asian universities. And they're desperate in Asia, especially in China, to move into the top 100. And it's very important, I mean, and it's remarkable. I mean, just think of the paucity of modern language skills in British educational systems. I did a lecture in Sichuan University, not a significant university by any means, some years ago, for 400 people, and they stopped the translator after 5 minutes because they could all understand it in English. This is just an ordinary university in the middle of Sichuan province. So my riders on this would be not to fall into the trap of instrumentalism, and I mean by the range of curriculum. I don't know enough about this because I don't deal with the school sector, but I know that many Chinese schools and many agents in China are desperate to get UK-style elements into their curriculum. Forget all the stuff about Shanghai being wonderful at mathematics. They fake the figures. They just show some of the best schools linked to the key universities. And even then, they really, really want to do things not only like drama and music, but do difficult subjects, and to force their students, if that's the right word, to break out of what's the fundamental problem of the Chinese education system at every single level, is that the idea that there's a right answer, that you must learn the right answer. Learning by rote is good as a low cognitive skill, but it's not a high cognitive skill, which is what you need in a developed economy. And that leads me to my other point, which is it's been a prevailing element of educational theory linked to economics in Britain since the 1950s that skills equal qualifications. Qualifications are bits of paper, and the government, ever since the 1950s and 60s, has elevated qualifications and said we've got more qualified people, we've got higher skills. This is not the case. It's especially not the case since they changed norm referencing to criterion referencing, which meant that just by pushing people through assessment, you could appear to get a better education system. So we need to do something about that. I would very simply, and this is me, speaking as a parent and citizen rather than educator, I would make A-levels harder in harder subjects in order to improve our system, to make us more competitive. I'd take one thing from Europe, which is the German technical system, and reintroduce equality across the board of technical expertise along with academic expertise. I would scrap the REF because it encourages short-termism, and even alongside research funding, it means that without tenure, people cannot develop really, really good ideas. Example of how to do it would be MIT, which allows their best students to just go and do what they want for an indefinite period of time. Or as a friend of mine says, without Werner Herzenberg, there is no Steve Jobs. And finally, I would push students much harder, both in terms of the fact of not tolerating their squeamishness and making them work really, really hard. Yes, they paid for it, but if they don't like it, they could leave. Okay.
Thank you, Alan. Over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sure many of you are already successfully providing services overseas, and I'm sure many more of you will be doing that. But I just wanted to share my own sort of personal thoughts on what I've seen work in that regard. And I think there are four things that I've noticed seem to be effective if you want to provide your services overseas. And the first, I think, is perceptiveness. I think you have to be able to show that you not only understand the system you're working in, but you can be perceptive about what will help. An example of not being perceptive happened to me in Morocco on a business/family trip last summer when I was in a restaurant with my family, and it was our 21st wedding anniversary, and I'd been unusually thoughtful and phoned ahead and ordered a cake. But unfortunately, due to my disastrous French, we didn't get a 21st wedding anniversary cake. They brought out a 21st birthday cake. And I could see them looking at me and looking at my wife, who's of a similar age, and wondering which one had told the other that we were 21. Look, without a shadow of false graciousness, I can say they gave the cake to my wife, which was definitely the right call. So that wasn't very perceptive, and that's because I wasn't communicating very well. And that's, of course, a big challenge working internationally, because it's not just the language, it's actually what we mean by grades, by levels, by even language around teaching and learning. And I was amazed sometimes when I was working, particularly in the Middle East, with GEMS, at people who would come, perhaps from a UK business, with a product, essentially with the message, this has worked pretty well in the UK and it solves a particular problem we've got. It'll probably solve a problem that you've got as well. And often it didn't, because there hadn't been that sort of time to really understand what our problems would be. So perceptiveness would be the first. I think then that allows you to resonate with purpose. Everybody in education, I've found, is in it because at the end of the day they want to make a difference to the people they're working with. It is about the transformative power of education. And I always reflect on my dad, who was born in 1945 from a working class family. He left school with no qualifications at the age of 16, but he was supported to go through an HND and a degree, ended up working in academia. But we know even in the UK that ability of education to transform lives, sadly, since about the 1950s, has really gone into reverse. And most countries I find in the world are really still struggling with this conundrum. We know that education can and does unlock people's potential, but only where it's used in the right way with students with the right mindset. And that challenge is as true in Asia, in the Gulf, in Africa. And so understanding that and what it is that people are trying to achieve is important. And I think that leads to the third point, which I had called the school-led system. And I thought about calling it profession, because then I thought I could move on to the 4 Ps. But then I thought I might sound like I was bringing back blockbusters from the 1980s, or making a call for a break for the restroom. So I'm going to stick with school-led system. And obviously in different countries, there are different levels of maturity in this regard. But I think the aim of any system really is to make sure that the professionals who are delivering that system, and also the teachers, students and parents who are engaging with it, are fundamentally at the heart of how it works best. And most governments are trying to achieve something that will deliver that. And one thing that surprises me is that there are relatively few tools and services and products that I think really help a school-led system to start to drive itself. I've been working with a couple of the larger international school groups recently, and actually it's surprisingly difficult if you just want to do what might seem to be in this day and age relatively simple things around joining up finance, IT, HR, data, student data. Yes, if you really want to get into quite a lot of extensive configuration, you can start to do that, but it's not that easy. And I do think that there's a real need for products to do that. However, that leads to my fourth P, patience. It takes a huge amount of time to get to that point, and therefore you have to be extremely selective and committed to where it is that you want to be, because it's just not going to happen overnight. A friend of mine's just opened a school in Tanzania, and it's taken about a year from getting started just to get to the point where the business licenses are in place and the permissions are in place, even to get started. If you go to, say, Rwanda, you can do it much more quickly because it's a much more sort of supportive environment. So I think patience is really important. I was really pleased to see the other day a project that we kicked off in GEMS while I was there probably 3 years ago in Myanmar, actually secured a government contract and some funding from the World Bank. That project finally got signed a week ago, and I'm sure you've all got stories like that. It's a very, very long-term game, which means, again, real commitment to the particular areas that you want to be involved in. So those are just my perceptions. I'm sure you've all got your own sort of war stories, experiences, and what you feel works. But for me, it's not easy work, but it's very worthwhile work, and it can make a huge difference and is important to do.
Thank you very much, Chris. Before we go out to the floor, and I'm keen to take as many questions as possible, I just want to pick up on something that Vipul and Alan in particular said. I mean, Vipul, you said the demand for EdTech, UK EdTech, is staggering. And Alan, you talk about the many thousands of Chinese officials and now people in the private sector that are looking to get a UK education. They may not be top of PISA, but they certainly, it seems like the UK is doing something right. Any thoughts around what it is that's distinct about UK education that makes it a strong export opportunity for us?
Sure. Partly it's driven by the fact that UK brand of education just translates to everything, right? And so the reason Chinese students want to come to the UK is the same reason why they also believe that everything connected to education from UK is good, right? So it's partly just brand, right? Secondly, it is, if again I talk about the curve, countries are totally aware that the UK is far ahead on the curve of EdTech, right? Start from whiteboards and the internet penetration. So your research said, suggests that we still have 10% of schools who don't have broadband, which is still a very big number. A high penetration for some of the other markets. So I think Chinese, especially Middle East, when they come to look at UK, they actually look at what's going on in schools and they're really impressed. I think events like BET, etc., the world comes to it. EWF, you've got 70 ministers from all over the world. So I think UK does a great job of promoting the whole edtech industry. Secondly, I think the presence of incubators, Emerge, etc., Visa Launchpad, I think those things, they spread quite easily now, especially with social networks out there, right? So I've actually had inquiries from Singapore, China, Brazil, people asking me, can you make introductions to some of the accelerators, etc. So the world knows it, right? So I guess the whole ecosystem that is present in UK that makes it possible.
Alan, when Vipul and I were on the EdTech trade mission, we were delighted that the University of Oxford was #1 in the THE World University Rankings on the day that we were actually kind of running the mission in Shanghai. I think actually Joe Johnson announced it before the THE did.
When you were now Vice-Chancellor.
but I mean, we know that the University of Oxford is #1 in the world at the moment, but what is it? What are the elements that actually make it world leading? Do you think it is?
Well, the league tables are useful up to a point. Clearly the top 5 are better than one is number 500, but I mean, there's hardly anything between the top universities, and that's why it shifts around a little bit. And it is a branding exercise. Just look at it from my narrow point of view, in terms of the reason why many Chinese officials came to Britain, and they also came to Europe, was a political one, is that at the end of the 80s, the neoliberal experiment in Chinese policy demonstrably failed, with the Gini coefficient just going wider and wider and wider and higher and higher. So they adopted bizarrely, they came back to what you might call a social democratic model, and they wanted to come to European countries. More specifically, they wanted to come to Britain because they're scared of any form of political instability, and historically Britain is one of the most stable countries in the world, so they're interested in that. So it's a strategic thing. That's how it affects me. Anecdotally, he's now gone back to become a professor of law at Beijing University. The best interpreter we ever had told me in passing is that he only came to Oxford because he couldn't get into Harvard. So effectively we are just below Harvard, yeah, in terms of that. And the other thing about us is that we've got the largest China centre of anywhere outside the Kennedy School. We've got more academics working on every aspect of China, from Chinese classical civilization through to contemporary China. And that means that we've got a lot of people who know what they're talking about. I think on the other side of that, and this is the broader question, it's again to watch out, is that a lot of people in Britain, in the universities, think it's a meal ticket. Yeah? That there are a lot of really bad one-year master's courses that people go back from really disgruntled. And that also affects the brand. The final point I'd make is that the market in Britain, just in market terms, is much more limited. The real market is getting into China. And I don't think that's necessarily by building campuses, although Ningbo has been successful. I think it's in terms of basically how you reposition the university and the school sector, which is along the lines of 21st century economy. And alongside the idea of thinking and, really sending the best people there, it's the fact that China is just, it's picking up on the R&D figure. I mean, most of it is wasted, but China spends twice as much on R&D than any other country in the world, I think, in terms of its GDP. And so there's a huge amount of potential there for business and for education.
And before we go out to the floor, Chris, any thoughts on that?
My thought on the HE sector is that we've been through a number of waves, it seems to me, over the last sort of 3 or 4 decades, from the initial kind of clear exporting of branch campuses, and then we've had the big sort of government-driven, investment-driven approaches like Iskandar in Malaysia, some of which has been really successful, some of which has quite struggled, and I think we're now moving into another kind of model. There's been quite an interesting program in Australia, the Australian Education City, where the government is co-commissioning the provision of 3 leading international universities, which they are is to be decided through a series of partnership dialogues, where it's trying to bring the best of what those universities have, but also really meet the needs of, in this case, a patch of land outside Melbourne, which is derelict and needs to be redeveloped in East Wirrabee. And it seems to me there's kind of an increasing maturity to how that's being done. But it also seems to me that for UK universities, some have had their fingers a little burnt, perhaps with branch campuses. The return on investment for that is very long. And for many British universities, it's really the ability to add to research concentration and excellence that's by far the more important thing. But nonetheless, there isn't a bottomless pit of money, so it has to be sustainable. I think that's a kind of an interesting model going forwards, and it may be that the provision of services and some of the sort of more back office things are better done by organisations already located in country, because it's quite hard to create those things from the start, whereas the academic excellence and maybe some of the learning services that sit around it and perhaps some of the technology that supports it are the things that can be taken across to another country.
Thank you. We have time for one round of questions.
Given the panel we had earlier talking Brexit and the Brexit effect, I don't know if it's a typical Britishness, but we're not very good as a nation, in spite of our excellent trade association, at being arrogant with regards to our achievements and our abilities. I mean, EdTech, you've probably got more expertise and experience in terms of EdTech sitting in this room than you're likely to experience anywhere else, certainly in the world. And BISA has a thriving EdTech membership. How does the panel think that we should become more arrogant in terms of the way we present ourselves? How should we celebrate more our achievements and convince those policymakers who continue to kick what we do and criticise what we do, and to pick up on what you were saying, Alan, about what's happening in Shanghai, highlight those realities and to build up our part, particularly in light of the Brexit effect.
Great.
Vipul, you mentioned that you had a huge amount of interest, 1,000 companies that were looking to export, edtech companies, and you said that you wanted to be more scientific in your approach to that. Have you got any ideas about how you're going to approach that, or could you use some input from us to help with that?
Thank you, Maria. If I could come back to the panellists actually in the order that you spoke, and if you just have 2 minutes to respond to some of those, but also any final comments as well.
Okay, so I guess I've got 2 minutes to respond to two very good questions. I don't think the idea is to be more arrogant, because I think that would go against what I would recommend. And the reason I say that is because UK is absolutely recognized at the forefront of edtech. But what I do find in a lot of conversations is that UK companies tend to be less flexible to adjust to where we're selling to, right? So almost whatever we sell needs to adapt to the local systems, education systems, sales process, etc. And what I find is that a lot of British companies, I literally had this experience last week, where we had somebody from Brazil who didn't speak very much English, and I put it in front of an edtech company, and they went straight into a spiel, speaking at about faster than I do, and I speak pretty fast, and and they were just lost. And so they didn't bother asking, what the problem is. They said, here's my solution, right? And so I saw arrogance there, and I think that probably goes against if you're trying to do international business. So I think in terms of what you can do to promote it more, just being out there at more events will just get you out there, right? So just meeting people, that's probably the number one thing. But I would just take a bit of caution on that. Maria, to your question on how can we be more scientific. So at a random beer evening with Patrick, we had an idea of the biggest challenge we have currently is communicating the UK edtech offer. And I always again say the same story. In China, met somebody and and I was asking them, what are you looking for in UK edtech? And they said, what have you got to offer? And we had this bit of a weird conversation. I said, what do you want? He said, what do you have to offer? And we went back and forth. And I realized that communicating the UK edtech offer was actually very difficult. And so what we're now trying to do, and I'm trying to get a budget for, is to effectively communicate the edtech offer, where you literally go to a market, especially to people in our embassies, who will eventually be talking to the ministries, talking to the school groups, and saying, this is what UK edtech offer looks like. And currently, it is extremely difficult to communicate. So that is what I'm going to embark on, and I've got the green flag on, and I need help, because I'm not going to sit in my room and do this. So I'm absolutely going to turn to Visa, and the likes to try and come up with what that looks like.
Some of the best ideas come out of random beer evenings in Beijing.
They'll do it, don't they?
Alan, over to you.
Well, at the risk of sort of introducing something which I can't get to the bottom of, and I've been trying to think about this for some time, is you remember that the structure of the university system, both in Britain and internationally, has hardly changed since the middle of the 19th century, with the introduction of research universities, initially Johns Hopkins, and then using the German model of research. And it really does need to be reconfigured without losing the central core of teaching undergraduates, which is actually being lost. So the reconfiguration of how the universities operate, particularly between government, the education sector, and probably business. And I think the basis of that is investment by government and business. I think government can invest. It works. I mean, there's been very good work, I think, particularly University of Sussex, on the role of state intervention, as opposed to in China. IBM, for example, got huge amounts of money from the government. The US space program is a very good example of spin-offs. All of these things can happen. If it seems bizarre, the government actually has to operate like a venture capitalist. 9 of them won't work, but the 10th one will be fantastic. And to a degree, that happens in Oxford and other universities. In Oxford, it happens through ISIS Innovation, which has set up 500 spin-off companies in the last decade, now global, and is now operating highly successfully in China. And I think it means for you, I don't know enough about what you do as individuals and as a cohort, but it does mean you do have to go and set up offices there, because that's the only way, especially in an environment like China. I'm sure culturally it's different in other places. It's all based on, they call it guanxi, trust. You have to have a real relationship with somebody and build that up, and you need to be on the ground. Then you've got to worry about who you can trust. But that's the way you have to do it, and there are hundreds of possibilities, not just in Shanghai. After a long negotiation, the university is establishing a joint venture with Suzhou government, which is 15 minutes by high-speed train from Shanghai in an IT sector. I'm at the beginning of a discussion in Chengdu where they're potentially offering £1.2 million per year for each engineering researcher. And so it's all out there. I think also, just to finish, it's actually adapting and this is again reconfiguring it. The most successful innovation in Oxford, other than ISIS innovation in the last decade, has been the establishment of the Martin School, which brings together academics from many different disciplines, having identified global problems and then approaching them from as many different directions as possible. And that's an international success. And also just getting education up and running. I mean, the International Strategy Office, who didn't reply to me when I asked them what they wanted me to say, I spent a hell of a lot of time in Burma trying just to reconstruct the university system, and we can do that sort of thing as well. So that's me.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Chris.
So the question about how do we shout more loudly about what we have to offer, I mean, it's sort of really noticeable that if you look at, let's say, the German International Development Bank and the work that it funds, it's very happy and pleased to work hand in glove with its own supply sector in order to really sort of promote German solutions in the rest of the world. And we're always a bit more reticent about doing that. And it seems to me that there's a huge opportunity, and perhaps it's a sort of a spin-off, I don't know, from Brexit, if we're going to have a beefed up capacity around sort of international trade and affairs. In South Korea, they've been really good at working between the government, industry, the universities and the school system to help develop and sustain really, really high quality products, although one of them's been having problems lately, but generally speaking, very high quality products that the world really wants. And again, that's about strategy and partnership and sort of being a bit less Heath Robinson about how things happen and a little bit more structured. And I don't think there's any shame in that. I know that we love a free market, but I think sometimes the free market also needs some help to be really effective. And I think this is a good time to try and provide a bit more framing and guidance around that, so that we can really get the best from what we have to offer. And we do have that collaboration between the industry, government, the schools and the university sector, and really shout loudly, proudly and not arrogantly about what it is that we have to offer.
Really nice way to end the session. Thank you very much. Can we thank all of our panellists?
Thank you.